Today I'll speak on something very interesting. This is on understanding terrorism. Terrorism, if you see, and in this process, what I'll do is I also take you through emerging trends of terrorism in the South Asian region and also in India. In that process, also I'll highlight what are the measures the Indian state has taken to counter the terrorism and the terrorist kind of activities in this country. So talking about terrorism, what happens, like a lot of the existing literature or the body of literature that we have in understanding terrorism mostly engage this issue from a kind of policy orientation. Okay, they think that what should be the policy to counter terrorism. In this pursuit, what happens that we hardly find a conceptual framework around which we can actually deal with terrorism as a kind of security threat to the state and to the individual alike. It's not that it will be unfair to say that there are no conceptual kind of framework, but then the problem lies in the lack of consensus around this kind of conceptual framework. What actually defines or what actually connotes terrorism kind of thing. So when one goes through the existing literature, would find there are two important school of thoughts. When I'm saying two important school of thoughts, there are also other school of thoughts regarding terrorism. But these two important, I have chosen these two important school of thoughts. One is the psychosociological, and the second is the political rational or politico-rational kind of school of thought. Let me take you through the psychosociological kind of thing. When you are saying terrorism actually deals with the psychological aspects of the people. Okay, what exactly I mean? I mean that terrorism, okay, the immediate objective of any terrorist kind of an activity is to instill fear and create a kind of, a lot of anxiety in the minds of the individuals. Okay, that is the immediate kind of, goal of terrorism or any kind of terrorist act. And why it is important to sort of deal with or to engage with this process of instilling fear. This has the immediate effect of any terrorist activity has a larger kind of socio-political or socio-religious political kind of goal. It has an impact on that. But in this process, what happens? It actually creates a psychological or pure psychosis in the minds of the individuals. But this school, the psychosociological school, also tries to understand the root cause of terrorism. What are the causes? In that process, what happens? People also bring in the aspects of deprivation, the aspects of grievance, the aspects of subjugation, discrimination, kind of thing. So, for example, a very popular, if not academic, a popular narrative that you find in India is that why some religious group have taken up arm against the other, they bring in this grievance and the discrimination, deprivation kind of an argument onto the table. That just because they have been deprived, just because they've been discriminated for a long time, sociologically, religiously, or otherwise, people take up kind of an arm or a terror as a method to sort of not further their kind of an interest. But then this two schools that I'm talking about, the psycho-sociological and the politico-rational, are not binaries. They are complementary to each other. Okay, one should not create a binary here. Why I'm saying so? Because the immediate effect of the terrorist activity, that is the psychological aspect of it, has a long term, okay, or it is actually wrapped around a long-term political objective. So, for example, you must have heard of this terminology called political Islam. In order to capture sort of political authority, you need to carry out these kind of activities, okay, so that your end objective can be actually achieved. In this process, there is another aspect to this political rationale. Why the rational element becomes very important? that people try to, or this particular school, or the people who carry out these terrorist kind of activities, they try to rationalize or legitimize these acts of terrorism or the violent act of terrorism. That we condemn violence. Okay, in a civic society, we condemn violence, but somewhere we see that once these terrorist activities have been taken, you will find that there are some of the groups or the militant groups, they come forward, they shoot a video, and they project that we take the ownership of this terrorist activity, and it is absolutely fine with us, and they take pride of doing this thing. Okay, so that is where there is an element of rationalizing terrorism. Okay, this actually complicates the whole understanding of terrorism. You know, that is, for example, how and what nature of violence that instills fear in the minds of the people should be acceptable in a society, or what kind of violence that actually instills fear in the minds of the people, or creates some kind of an anxiety, will not be or should not be acceptable by the society. Okay, when we are talking about the society here, one also has to be very clear about the social, where the power relationship is very implicit, that the day-to-day life, you and me talking to each other over a cup of tea, there is the power relationship is very, very implicit. It is not very kind of, aggressive in its kind of, posturing. But there is also, when you're talking about the terrorism and the society, I'm actually mentioning about the political society, the social contract, the state. And then it becomes very clear that what kind of violence is acceptable in a kind of a civic society or a political kind of society. One can have disagreement, one can go on to contest it, but that contestation is within the framework of what is being kind of accepted in the society. So, for example, we all have given or delegated our power to the state, that the state can use the violent forces, okay, if someone goes against the rule of the law. So to that extent, a counter-terrorism measure by any state, okay, it's not only India, by any state, okay, is considered to be a legal and legitimate kind of an action. Okay, so for example, when the police chases a mob, okay, in that process, what happens that few people who are not responsible or not part of the mob are also being beaten down. Okay, that also instills fear in the minds of the people. Okay, but we do not call it as a terrorist kind of an activity, because we have accepted or we have delegated the power, we have signed a social contract with the state that the state can use violence. For that, what we do, that often we take the help of the judiciary to punish the police forces who have actually done this extra legal kind of activities. So you see, there is a difference between this kind of terminology that we use. We call it the extrajudicial, extra legal kind of an activity by the police, but we would not call it as a kind of terrorism kind of activity. So then the very framework, through these two schools, what I'm trying to do is to clarify the ambiguity around that good terrorism, bad terrorism, people are actually using violence as a method for a cause. Okay, so for example, the revolutionary violence, some of the people say, justifying violence and killing innocent people with a suspect that these are the informers of the police, that the Maoists of India actually do often, killing civilians. Similarly, we should not be very, unclear about the thing that putting a bomb or planting a bomb in a very busy market and killing the innocent people as a revolutionary violence, that we should actually avoid that kind of ambiguity in our thing. But then we also should not get into the root cause too much. Okay, that is, and that is a process through which we also try to legitimize that, okay, this particular section of the society has been discriminated, hence they have actually adopted a violent kind of method to fight for justice or to demand for justice. Okay, this is a kind of ambiguity that we need to clear. So for our better understanding of terrorism that we are going to discuss today in length, a terrorist kind of an act that actually tries to instill fear in the minds of the people, okay, and where the face of the agency of the terrorism or the terrorist kind of, the agents who carry out kind of terrorist activities are not known. Moreover, the target, say for example, if there is a terrorist organization, it has a problem with Indian government, okay, it should target the government, not the innocent people. That is where the enemy, the target or the target of the population is not clearly defined. Okay, so it is very clear from this point of view. I'll not get into the history of terrorism. That is, this is a learned kind of, very, very intelligent audience. So what I'll do is I'll just take you through some of the emerging trends of the terrorism that in the recent years we are encountering. As students of security studies, you will also find that terrorism is often linked with the kind of, non-state actors. The militant organizations or the collectivities that necessarily do not have a social contract with the people. So we call it as a kind of, non-state actor. Okay. So what happens that what has been happening now that for last 20, 30 years, that this distinction between terrorism as an act of the non-state actor, okay, so this state versus non-state kind of, distinction has been blurred. Has been blurred because we have also seen, this is a foreign policy school, this becomes very important for all of us to actually know that. Just imagine the case of Pakistan. Okay, this has become, a stated state policy of the, like in the Pakistan state, to use terrorism as a method in dealing with its neighbor country called India or Bangladesh or Afghanistan to that matter. Okay, we have also seen in Bangladesh when the BNP, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party was in government, we have also seen that the militant organizations or the terrorist organizations like the Jamaatul Mujahid in Bangladesh or some other JMJB kind of, militant organizations, terrorist organizations were actually used by the state to further its interest or to settle its kind of, score within neighboring India. So then to say that, it is only the non-state actors, often whenever we actually produce a dossier to say, for example, the Mumbai attack in 2016, whenever we actually produce a kind of, document to the Pakistani state seeking for, handing over this kind of, Lashkar-e-Taiba and other organizations, leaders or their terrorist members to India so that they can be booked, we often are told, or the Pakistani state says, that we do not have any control over them. Okay, meaning that these are non-state actors that are functioning, okay, outside the purview of the state, so we do not have any control. But then over the years, what we have seen that there is an increasing involvement of the states like Pakistan, states like Afghanistan these days. Okay, the use of terrorism as a method in actually kind of, in the foreign relations. So to that extent, we have seen, or we have been seeing that there is the distinction between the state versus the non-state kind of, thing, that the terrorism is limited to the non-state actor has been blurred. The second emerging trend that we have been dealing with is that we are still in the mindset, okay, we are still trying to understand, or we engage with terrorism as a security threat or terrorism as a socio-political issue through the prism of US-centric approach. Okay, so for example, till 2000, until 9/11, we actually didn't have a clear-cut kind of, though, India was the first country in a way to provide a definitional framework for terrorism. Whether it was accepted or not, that is a different story. We can have a discussion around that. But then you see, even in India or elsewhere in the globe, a lot of this terrorism became a kind of buzzword, or terrorism became a very important subject to deal with Only after the US started, engaging with something called the global war on terrorism. Okay, so there, what you see, India was also the first country immediately after the 9/11 kind of an attack. What we did, that we also kind of banned SIMI, Student Islamist Organization kind of thing. We also banned a lot of other terrorist kind of organizations. We also jumped to the bandwagon saying that, okay, we should fight the global terrorism kind of thing. But let me tell you that most of these kind of terrorist organizations, those who function in the Indian subcontinent or the South Asian region kind of thing, do not have the global ambitions. Okay, but maybe in their literature, the Islamic kind of terrorist organizations that function, they might write, or they in fact, it is there that the end objective is to establish a Islamic Ummah kind of thing, a caliphate or whatever terminology you use. But then their modus operandi or their, the scope of activities are limited to the South Asian region. To that extent, to have a kind of US-centric approach in understanding terrorism doesn't actually provide a complete picture of understanding terrorism. Okay, so the emerging trend that we are seeing right now, that the countries like India have also taken steps to understand the specificity of individual terrorist groups, their scope, their nature, their ideological framework, and the local kind of support base around which they actually, function and they carry out their kind of activities. When we are actually, dealing with the local specificities, how the terrorist organizations are actually drawing support, what are the local causes, what are the kind of the immediate kind of territorial and socio-political kind of causes that leads to the emergence of a terrorist group and the terrorist activities. What we are seeing that we cannot actually distinguish. It will not be very fair to see the local incidents and the global kind of trends in isolation. When there has to be a lot of importance to be given to understand the local specificities, we also need to see the global kind of happenings or the global kind of activities that has important implications or the influence on the local, right? So to that extent, if you see another important trend in Indian kind of terrorism or the terrorism in Indian subcontinent is the growing radicalization among the youth. Okay, so that is where what you see, there is a very interesting kind of an observation, I'll tell you. The youth is getting increasingly radicalized. There are various factors. There is something called the larger Islamic cause people should fight for. Some people also bring in the economic standard of some of the people, the poverty being the one of the important cause for the people being radicalized. They join some kind of militant organizations or the terrorist organizations for some kind of money. But then we also see there is a very interesting kind of trend that the leadership of all these terrorist organizations continues to remain with the world people. Okay, you name any terrorist organization's leader, okay, starting from Afghanistan till India, okay, maybe, barring Yasin Bhatkal, okay, but then Yasin Bhatkal used to be remote controlled by Diaz Bhatkal and Iqbal Bhatkal, those who are, pretty old. So then, but then Indian Mujahideen is a bygone kind of thing. But then you will also observe, what we see that the leadership still lies with the world people. Yeah. So then the kind of, radical ideas that has been actually told to the people or being disseminated to the youth for some kind of, Islamic cause or for the larger cause that Islam is in threat, those kind of things, it is being guided, it is being controlled by the old leadership of all these organizations. What it exactly, implies? It implies that when the political authority of radicalism or radicalized kind of ideas are with the world, the young people or the youth is being used as the cannon fodder. Okay, because they can die. The youth can fight and die, and the world continues to actually. And this also reveals another important aspect, that the youth, okay, is highly emotional, contrary to the kind of social understanding we have, that the world are more emotional than the youth. So that is where the emotional aspect that transcends the identity and the goal of the youth. And this also highlights another thing, that the growing radicalization among the youth, or the more number of youth being radicalized, it also shows that the youth is not thinking about himself or herself. Okay, so the individuality of the youth is being completely diluted and overshadowed by the collectivity or the collective interest. What I was telling you, the larger interest of a religion, when you are saying, that is where the individual aspiration of a kind of a youth is completely diluted and is over-dominated. This is something we'll have to understand. When we'll see that in a democratic kind of setup like us, like in India, when you, me, and everyone, when we are thinking about or we are stressing upon our individual interest, that I should study, I should go abroad, I should have a PhD degree from abroad, I should have a fat check salary, all those things, when we start thinking, we will always run away from any radical kind of activity and kind of ideological framework. We think that resorting to some kind of ideological framework will hamper our individual interest. But in the case of radicalization, what we see, that the individual interest, okay, or the individual as a unit of analysis, as a social being, is being completely over-dominated by the religious leaders. There being the individual interest being over-dominated by the collective interest. So what it conceptually what it actually portends? It portends that whenever there is an over-dominance or superimposition of collective interest over the individual interest, that society is bound to be radical in nature. Okay, so next time you interact with someone, you will see wherever, in the name of the caste, in the name of any ideology, in the name of any religious identity, when someone is trying to impose on you that, okay, what about our religion? What about this ideology? What about our caste? What about our gender? Just imagine or just realize that this guy is trying to superimpose or dilute your individual interest. So this actually, is something that we'll have to keep in mind. Another important kind of trend that we witness in understanding terrorism in India, at least after Indian Mujahideen have been absolutely defrocked or not able to, after the arrest of Yasin Bhatkal in 2013, we have been, or the Indian state has been able to contain the terrorist activities to a great extent. But at the same time, the nature of terrorist activities have actually taken a very, very drastically new trend. What we are observing, that the terrorist attacks are no longer on the civilians. Okay, you just imagine, recently the High Court order came, 38 of the people who are responsible for the Ahmedabad blast have been, death sentence has been given to them. But imagine starting from 2008, Ahmedabad blast to Bihar to elsewhere in Hyderabad, in Bangalore, all these places, the main targets used to be the civilians. This has actually changed. The trend has actually changed. What we are seeing, that we are seeing a large number of terrorist attacks directed against the security forces. You say Pulwama, you say Uri, you say Pathankot, all those kind of examples are there for you. Okay, so the terrorists are trying to actually instill fear or in the minds of the civilian through attacking the security forces. Okay, in that process, they send out a message that the security forces who are actually in the charge of providing you defense and security, they are also equally vulnerable like you. we can actually strike on them, okay, and get away, right? And to that extent, there is another important thing that comes, that the less number of incidents, what we see, that are very less number of incidents, but whenever it is happening, it actually taking the large casualties, 25 security officers being killed, security of people have been killed and all that. Terrorism, another important trend is that terrorism has been replaced by, okay, what I'm saying is that terrorist activities of the incidents of casualty and killing has been replaced by a number of kind of riots, communal riots. Okay, that is where they are trying to instill fear and create a kind of social disturbances, okay, through the garb of, or through the guise of something called the social issues. The anti-CA is a classic example. Now the hijab thing is a classic example. And look, what are the organizations who are actually carrying it out? The Popular Front of India, okay, which is nothing less than a kind of radical organization that actually speaks about radical Islam and all that. When we are seeing this, that in more number of kind of communal violence, communal kind of riots are actually taking place, okay, very organized way, the role of civil kind of the role of kind of social media and the use of high-end technology, also come to our notice. What we are seeing, that are very dedicated people who are well educated, well versed with technology, well versed with all sorts of kind of modern technology and all that. They are the ones are disseminating or spreading some of the ideas that actually catches the mind of the people. Okay, it creates a kind of impression in the minds of some of the vulnerable people that you are being targeted by the majority of the people. You are being targeted by the government. You have been discriminated by the government. So to that extent, what we see, the propaganda machinery, the trend through which, or the modus operandi that was being used to do the propaganda, that has also drastically changed. The WhatsApp messages that actually goes like wildfire. Okay, that has actually taken over the propaganda machinery kind of thing. There is another important kind of trend we see in the terrorism and the religious radicalization kind of thing. There is a wonderful kind of combination of ideological extremism and religious kind of extremism, at least in the Indian context. We are seeing the people who subscribe to the left-wing extremism kind of violence, okay, Maoism kind of violence, they are coming in contact with the Islamist or any other religious kind of minority extremist kind of organizations. And why it is happening? It is happening through something called the common enemy factor. The Indian state, okay, and the parliamentary democracy that actually doesn't approve of any religious kind of extremism or any ideological kind of extremism is portrayed as a common enemy among this kind of the support base. Okay. What is another important thing? This is a much debated kind of thing, that this process of communal riots and process of kind of use of high-end technology and the coming up of religious extremism and ideological extremism together, you will also notice that there has emerged a very important trend that this kind of disruptive or subversive kind of activities are being able to create, okay, some lootable resources. When I'm saying lootable resources, of course, the economic resource is very much part of it. You see, lakhs of rupees, okay, a lot of rupees changing hands. Okay. At the same time, it also creates a lot of social and political resources. The emergence of leaders. Okay. So anti-CA, you'll see that, okay, some of the people you didn't know about, they become all of a sudden leaders. We have also seen some of the Muzaffarnagar kind of riot, what are the kind of people became the political leaders, representing one community or the other. right? So this has become this rioting, violence, or terrorist kind of an activities. Okay, this has given rise to a trend of creating or manufacturing a lot of lootable resources, and there is very little competition there. Okay, people with some kind of expertise in engineering a kind of disruptive activity can actually cash upon it as a very powerful kind of leader, right? So the last thing I'll tell you, that terrorism, okay, or the understanding of terrorism should not be limited to the mere numbers. Okay, what has been the government response? The government, if you see the parliamentary debates or the parliament questions and all that, the government often says that the number of terrorist incidents or terrorist-related kind of activities have gone down. That is where the successive governments, they try to boast around it. Okay, but that is a very limited understanding of terrorism. Okay, when you limit terrorism as mere numbers, or it is confined to a particular territoriality, you tend to forget that these processes of radicalization or the pro-social engineering of authorization, that we do not belong to this country, they do not belong to this country, okay, we have been discriminated and all that, this takes a solid shape in the social kind of interactions. So I stop it here. You have any questions, kindly ask me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anshuman, for a very comprehensive coverage of the very important subject, that is terrorism and radicalization. And before I ask the participants to put questions to you, I would like to ask you one thing in the beginning. We face terrorist or terrorism, this factor, not only from outside. External threat is there. There is an internal threat also. And secondly, this non-state actors is become a tool in the hands of certain countries, foreign policy goals and all that. So is there any international mechanism or a formulation or agreement to prohibit the countries, the states, not to use non-state actors as a foreign policy tool? Whether in the case of Pakistan, has the international pressure been sufficient to curb the activities on the part of the government, not to support the non-state actors?
When we are talking about the international pressure, theoretically speaking, there are many such kind of policies through the UN, through many of these bilateral and multilateral kind of arrangements that is there in place. We SAARC, South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, has a very robust kind of counter-terrorism kind of mechanism. But then if you see, international is being controlled by few countries. Okay, you name Pakistan, you name China, you name US, Russia, France, UK kind of countries. They control the international, the so-called international. In that process, you don't need me to tell you that how the international or the foreign countries have actually manipulated. They have manipulated the kind of all these agreements to the extent they have given indirect legitimacy to a lot of these terrorist organizations, starting from Al-Qaeda to Taliban. Okay, and you name, say for example, when we wanted Masood Azhar, China would veto it. Okay, so the lack of consensus and the petty kind of domestic interest of some of the countries, has been a greater hindrance in having a consensus among the nations to actually, that is then the debate, the absolutely bogus kind of debate that comes, a good terrorist, bad terrorist, a terrorist for you becomes a freedom fighter for me, those kind of things. Okay, the basic line that anybody who goes against a legitimate government of a country, which has been recognized, acknowledged by the people, should be considered as a kind of terrorist group. Okay, that we fail to understand. or that we fail to kind of operationalize. And the regions are very, very obvious. The region is like some petty national kind of interest of respective countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Behera. Now I ask the participant to put questions to him. Yes, come on. Introduce yourself and put your question.
Good evening, sir. My name is Pranjal and I am a student of IR at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Sir, recently we have noticed the increased incidents of lone wolf terrorist attacks around the world. And in the cases of lone wolf attacks, we have also seen that these individuals are often do not came often on intelligence surveillance network and also do not have any contact to the terror groups. So what are the implications of these lone wolf terrorist attack on the overall security architecture of a country? And my another question is that can we consider the increased radicalization or hate as one of the major causes of behind these attacks?
Okay, thank you. This lone wolf kind of attack that we are discussing, that actually appeared when there are major attacks or minor attacks in the European countries. So the European scholars who wanted to understand terrorism, they also came up with this kind of thing, that these are self-radicalized kind of people. There is some element of truth in that, the people get self-radicalized, but then one has to actually understand what is the ideological framework around which they get radicalized. Okay, what is the source of this thing? Okay, the source of the radicalization is necessarily, belong to a particular organization or a particular kind of thing that has actually kept all those kind of literature, videos, and all those kind of, propaganda literature in the media. Okay. People often also bring in this kind of disturbed minds. Okay, people who have criminal record, they are more vulnerable or more fragile to sort of adopting this kind of radical this thing. In that process, what I was telling you from the beginning, that people who try to find out the root cause of terrorism, okay, or to try to find out that some violence is because there is a kind of basis to it, this actually dilutes the very urgency or the importance, the criticalities that involved in dealing with terrorism kind of thing. The lone wolf kind of thing it doesn't make much of a kind of a sense to me, because the lone wolf is not alone. He's not targeting someone because of his kind of, personal interest. I can understand if I didn't give you a first class degree, I'm a professor in your university. If I didn't give you first class mark, you come and slap me, I can understand. But if you come and slap me just because you belong to a particular religion and you felt that your religious values has been kind of, hurt or something because of my teaching, then the problem lies in the radicalization or the radical thoughts that is being there. So the lone wolf kind of radicalization or the lone wolf kind of terrorism that we often talk about, it doesn't get confined, or it's not confined to the individual. It's not confined to the lone wolf. The wolf is very much part of the herd. The wolf is very much part of the group. Okay, the group is maybe it is scattered, but nonetheless it is a group. Okay, one has to understand that. And so, for example, Zakir Naik, all these speeches and all that, people actually got motivated, radicalized, and you have one attack in Bangladesh and one attack in Sri Lanka. Okay, so how far it will be fair to say that these are self-radicalized youth? Okay, so there is something called the oil split joints. You would put a drop of oil in water, it actually splits. But the thing is, the origin of that particular drop actually is there. The origin, one has to trace that origin somewhere. Okay, the radical thoughts that come from Zakir Naik kind of people. Okay, it's very, very important to deal with. And once you find and try to identify that, the source of these radical thoughts, it will not be very appropriate to call them kind of lone wolf. The lone wolf is very much part of the herd, of the group. Thank you.
Next question, please.
Good evening, sir. I am Anushka. I am a student at Bachelor's of Mass Media from Jai Hind College, Mumbai. My question to you is, as we are talking about radicalization and the ways to stop it, but what do we do when people when people are elected to legislative assemblies are themselves accused of terror attacks? For example, Pragya Thakur, she is still under trial for multiple charges under UAPA, and she was one of the main prime in 2008 Maligaon bombings, where 10 people were killed and more than 82 were injured. So what do we do then?
This is something you'll find, this is a multi-edged kind of sword. Your democracy that you are living in, this is the strength and the weakness of democracy as well. So Pragya Thakur is not the only example. Okay, you have 1976 Bholanath Pandey, who hijacked a plane, a Delhi to Lucknow bound plane, okay, demanding the release of Indira Gandhi. What would you call someone who hijacks a plane? You will call him a terrorist, right? Yeah. So, but then Congress party went on to sort of make him as a legislator. Okay, so what happens that, as I was telling you, the terrorism or the discourse of terrorism creates a lot of lootable resources. Okay, and one of such lootable resources is the political resource. You have seen, like, the political parties garlanding people accused of communal violence. Communal violence is no less than terrorist activities. Okay, we have seen it, and we have been, living with such kind of thing. So to have one such example, this country is full of such kind of an example. But then as academics, as kind of, experts on understanding the security, we need to keep highlighting these issues, keep writing. Okay. So what you do means, Anna, I would suggest you that keep writing about it, saying that how this dilutes the very discussion about terrorism when this kind of, dented and kind of, accused personalities. They have not been sentenced they have not been convicted. So they have all the democratic right to sort of, contest the election. But it sends out a very wrong message to the society, to the political agreement or the social contract that we have, that even if some people are accused of some kind of, very grave murder or kind of, terrorist activities, can get elected to the parliament and start ruling the people. Okay, this is a very disturbing sign. But then, this is, as I told you, this is a merit, this is a strength and weakness of Indian democracy.